a website that gives you advice, in case anybody here is interested in this, on how to grow marijuana. In case anybody here is interested in that. And what you have to do is you have to pump the CO2 in your basement up to about 1,000 parts per million. Bear in mind the CO2 in the atmosphere now is about 380. So what you have to do is about triple the CO2 in your basement to about 1,000 parts per million, and this causes the plants. Higher CO2 causes greater plant life, right? And so the idea that CO2 is a pollutant is just blatantly absurd. Now, there are thresholds to this, of course. You get above 2,000 parts and it starts to become detrimental to plants. Like anything else, there's a range, right? But the idea that it is a pollutant and dangerous to life is simply absurd. CO2, I'm breathing. And by the way, the idea that plants stop it too is also absurd. Plants, of course, interact with their environment. When plants die and rot, they give off CO2 when they rot, after they're dead. So the idea that the Amazon is replenishing the atmosphere, oxygen in the earth is ridiculous. When an Amazon plant dies, it rots and gives off CO2. The whole thing's ridiculous. So the Bush EPA refused to declare CO2 a danger to public health. So these states sued. And the Supreme Court came back with a decision in 2007 that said, if the EPA declared CO2 a public endangerment, then the EPA must invoke the Clean Air Act and regulate CO2 as a pollutant. You get the connection in the logic? If the EPA declares CO2 an endangerment, then they must invoke the Clean Air Act. Clean Air Act was, of course, first originally designed for automotive exhaust and that kind of thing. It was never designed for this kind of thing. Now, then in the summer of 2008, the Bush EPA released an advance notice of proposed rulemaking in which there was a clear warning issued by the EPA itself as well as by Susan Dudley of the Office of Regulatory Affairs that said, if you use the Clean Air Act as the guideline for EPA regulation, it will cause the powers of the EPA, of this agency, to magnify and grow to the point where it will affect every household in the land. And that is a quote. Every household in the land. It will end up with regulation of lawnmowers. There will have to be a CO2 standard for lawnmowers, a grams per meter standard for the regulation of lawnmowers. It would require permitting, federal building permits for commercial buildings. Every building in the United States heated with natural gas would fall under federal permitting authority. It would require the regulation of the digestive systems of cows because they fart. And this gives off methane, which is one of these gases. You can't make this stuff up. I'm not good enough of a fiction writer. This stuff is all there. This stuff is all there. When farmers till the soil and turn the soil over, it releases CO2. It would require then small farmers to register their agricultural activity, and it would put in the neighborhood of 2 million small farmers out of business because they would simply be unable to bear the regulatory costs. The Bush administration, to its credit, I'm a big critic of the Bush administration on many issues, but in this regard, they laid out a clear warning to the American public in this advance notice of proposed rulemaking. Use of the Clean Air Act would expand this agency's regulatory power to the point where it would inject itself into every area of everybody's life and affect, quote, every household in the land, unquote. In response, and this, by the way, this notice of proposed rulemaking came out because President Bush issued an executive order which ordered the various cabinet departments to cooperate in complying with the Supreme Court order. Why did he have to order the various departments to cooperate? Because this order would allow the EPA to take over jurisdiction over many areas now controlled by other cabinet departments. For example, EPA would now take over many areas now controlled by transportation. The EPA would now be able to set national speed limits. Just to take one example. If EPA decides that CO2 is high on the highways, EPA could set the speed limits at 55 miles an hour or 50 miles an hour if it decides. So EPA, there'd be no cabinet energy. EPA could obviously take over almost all the controls of the energy department. Right? So EPA would become the super totalitarian agency in Washington. And it was all laid out in this, because CO2 is such an ubiquitous gas. I mean, you give it off when we give it off when we breathe, cows give it off when they fart, you give it off when you turn a spade of soil, you give it off when you turn the thermostats. The federal government would be empowered to put in electronic thermostats in your home and monitor your home thermostats, and even to require thermostats centrally set by the government. All of this is laid out, and I'm not making this up, and it's not inference and it's not extrapolation. It was all laid out. So now, with the new change in administration, the head of the EPA has changed, and the new EPA administrator, Jackson, is a real ideologue on this issue and shares none of this reticence. She almost immediately has declared CO2 to be a public danger, and they're writing all these regulations now. They have expressed, however, their preference that this not be done by regulation, but it be done by legislation. Now, the Lieberman-Warner bill of 2007 and 2008 actually died in committee. These were the cap-and-trade bills that came up under Bush. Notice Lieberman-Warner as the sponsors. And for those who think Joe Lieberman is a friend. Those bills basically died in committee. Why would EPA, even EPA itself in many cases, and others, prefer legislation? Well, because they know that if EPA passes the regulations, they will be hit with a barrage of lawsuits, which would basically hold them up for a decade in passing a lot of this stuff. And groups would challenge the regulations at every level, and it would take 10 years to go through the court system. Right? And a lot of this would be overturned in the courts and would create a huge legal mess. So they would prefer that this cap and trade be passed by legislative fiat instead of the fiat of the EPA. Thus the cap and trade bill that's coming along right now. Right? Is everything what I'm saying makes sense? Anybody got a question factually about what I've said? Anything I'm saying not make sense? The two prongs of regulation, either regulation by the EPA, by fiat, empowered by the Supreme Court's statement that they could use the Clean Air Act. The fact that because CO2 declared as a pollutant, CO2 just comes from everything, versus the cap and trade coming through the legislative proposal. As it stands right now, I am hoping that cap and trade is actually dead. Even Democratic senators who are in many Democratic, congressmen, I should say congressmen, because it's a congressional issue, it was a congressional issue passed, realize that they're from conservative districts. And even the Democrats know that this is a job killer. Don't believe for 1 second that any of this is about creating jobs or about stimulating the economy or any of that. This is motivated by this ideology of control. None of this is about creating jobs or stimulating the economy. All of this is about imposing these ideological views over this through control of the economy. I'll give you just one example of why that is so. Take so-called alternate power, solar and wind. Now it should be obvious that in the free market, if alternate and wind were good sources of energy, greedy capitalists, and I mean that in a positive sense, would jump right on this stuff, would start producing this stuff. Home Depot would be selling home solar kit and home wind kits. Or you can go to Home Depot, right? You can buy a home generator for your house. You can buy it yourself, have your own electrician put it in, do it yourself, or you can hire them and they'll do it, right? But you can't buy home solar or home wind kits from Home Depot. Why not?